Before the Stonewall riots, LGBT rights and freedom of love were not phrases that crossed many people's minds. Post-Cold War, society clung to the ideal nuclear family like a security blanket. The nuclear family gained popularity in the face of the Red Scare. Everyone scrambled to be a normal American, doing anything and everything to distinguish themselves from the dreaded communist. One man, one woman, and their children, just as God intended, right? Suburbia might have upheld these ideas of normativity. However, in the larger cities, counterculture blossomed. Even with underground culture, legislature was ratified to prohibit behaviors that were out of the social norm. In New York City, there was a criminal statute put in place allowing law enforcement to detain and arrest patrons wearing less than 3 gender-appropriate articles of clothing. Not only were there laws established to keep the hetero peace, society as a whole worked to cling to what they viewed as normal. Shame and discrimination played vital roles in this cruel game of oppression. Queer people's way of loving and living was recognized as purely a negative thing. Being gay or lesbian was treated as a psychiatric illness, and anyone who dared to voice opinions in opposition was ostracized from society. LGBT people were trapped in the closet, with feelings of guilt and shame swirling in their heads. Many tragically turned to self-institutionalization or even suicide. However, beneath the suffocating fog of oppression, discrimination, hate, and fear, something was brewing. With so many barriers in place blocking LGBT rights, the Stonewall riots would be the wrecking ball that breaks them all. On June 28, 1969, with the sound of the first glass shattering, the barriers would begin to fall. The Stonewall Inn was a small, grimy bar located in Greenwich Village, New York City. With shoddy plumbing and minimal running water, it may be surprising that the Stonewall Inn was wildly popular amongst party-going members of the LGBT community. In spite of its rough exterior, the Stonewall Inn was loved by those who went there for the freedom it provided. In 1966, the law prohibiting liquor sales to gay people was repealed, yet the majority of bars continued to refuse to permit and serve gay patrons. With potential customers being left rejected and thirsty, the New York City Mafia saw an opportunity for quick profit in operating bars specifically catered to gay and lesbian patrons of the Big Apple. The Genovese crime family purchased the Stonewall Inn a year prior to the riots. After undergoing some minor renovations, the Stonewall Inn was reopened as a gay bar. As one of the only gay bars in New York City that offered dancing, the Stonewall Inn was a popular spot for everyone from young gay runaways to closeted people in positions of power. The Mafia also made money off of gay bars by blackmailing those closeted higher-ups who would frequent the Stonewall Inn. The Genovese crime family had a few tricks to keeping their bar open. For one, the inn was listed as a bottle bar. This meant that they claimed not to be distributing any alcohol, but rather that their patrons were bringing their own drinks. In addition to this listing, the Genoveses paid off the law enforcement officers to prevent raids on the bar and to call ahead and warn the bar owners before a raid would occur. But on the night of the fateful Stonewall raid, there was no call to tip off the owners, and with no time to hide the liquor or clear out customers, it set an ominous tone for what was to follow. On the morning of the 28th, New York City police officers raided the Stonewall Inn. Armed with a warrant, the cops forcibly searched patrons and confiscated illegal liquor. They demanded identification from all their patrons to check genders and ages. The Stonewall Inn was a safe haven for closeted queer folks and runaways. Drag queens, who were not welcomed in many other gay bars for their gender fluidity, were welcomed by Stonewall with open arms. Showing their identification to the police was essentially relinquishing that freedom of acceptance and anonymity Stonewall had given the patrons. Therefore, many patrons failed to comply. Those who failed to produce identification or those whose gender markers did not match their gender presentation were taken aside by officers to have their sex checked. The criminal statute requiring 3 gender-appropriate articles of clothing to be worn led to the arrest of many patrons. Of those being checked, it is said that the drag queens were among the first to fight back against law enforcement. Marsha P. Johnson, a drag icon in the queer community, was one of the first patrons to stand her ground and refuse having her gender checked. Some accounts of the raids note Marsha P. Johnson hurling a shot glass at a mirror, inspiring others in the bar to refuse to comply. Many bargoers who fled the inn at the first sight of the cops congregated outside the bar as rumors circulated upon the happenings of inside. After enduring years of oppression, violence, and downright hate from the so-called protectors of the city, the people were sick of it. They were angry, and they were ready to fight. As arrested patrons were forcibly removed, the crowds mocked and jeered at the cops, flippantly saluting them and whistling. Though anti-compliance and protesting had already begun inside the bar, when Stormy de Larverie was brought out kicking and screaming, being clubbed for her fighting, she instigated the crowds to start fighting back by shouting, "Why don't you guys do something?" The crowds that greatly outnumbered the law enforcement officers fought with all they had. Throwing any objects the victims could find, police were hit with an onslaught of pennies, glasses, cobblestones, beer cans, and other trash found on the street. Protesters slashed tires and wreaked havoc upon the property surrounding the Stonewall Inn. Retreating back into the bar, the police hoped to escape the rioters. However, that plan backfired quite literally, when the rioters set the Stonewall Inn on fire. The surprise raid on the Stonewall Inn would be the catalyst to the historic Stonewall riots in the 6 days and 5 nights following. The LGBT people of New York were outraged. With so few places where they could be free, the loss of the Stonewall Inn was not one to be taken lightly. Christopher Street, Christopher Park, and the streets surrounding them in Greenwich Village would host monumental protests, finally breaking the barriers that the city had tried so desperately to uphold. The Stonewall riots exemplified the resilient spirit of queer people, as during the next 5 nights when protesters continued to show their support and fight for the cause. Michael Fader, a Stonewall riots veteran, illustrated the feelings of the rioters during those 5 fateful nights by stating, "We all had a collective feeling, like we'd had enough of this kind of shit. It wasn't anything tangible anybody said to anyone else. It was just kind of like everything over the years had come to a head on that one particular night in that one particular place. And it was not an organized demonstration. Everyone in the crowd felt that we were never going to go back. We weren't going to be walking meekly in the night and letting them shove us around. It's like standing your ground for the first time and in a really strong way, and that's what caught the police by surprise. There was something in the air, freedom, a long time overdue, and we're going to fight for it. It took different forms, but the bottom line was, we weren't going away, and we didn't." The Stonewall riots demonstrated a truth that the members of the LGBT community knew well. To make change, you need to make noise. As the barriers fell, protesters forged onward through the debris to take advantage of this pathway the protesters had trailblazed. The aftermath of the Stonewall riots was not a perfect society for queer people to exist in. However, there was newfound social leeway and liberation that was not open before. Stonewall paved the path for many of the rights appreciated by the LGBT community today. After 6 days and 5 nights of protests and political demonstrations, the historic Stonewall riots were over, but the fight was not finished as the battle for LGBT rights continues to this day. However, the raid of the Stonewall Inn and the protests that followed played an instrumental role in igniting the fire of the gay rights movement. Furthermore, the Stonewall riots aided in breaking societal barriers that trapped people in the closet. With those barriers breached, organizations dedicated to pursuing equal rights for all, regardless of sexuality or gender identity, were founded. The Gay Liberation Front, Parents and Friends of Gays and Lesbians, and the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation were all queer rights organizations founded in the wake of the Stonewall riots. In the great words of Marsha P. Johnson, "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us." Post-Stonewall, Americans fought again and again for gay rights. The Clinton Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill attempted to sell watered-down equality to American servicemen and women. However, the bill was met with harsh backlash for its discriminatory ways and was repealed during the Obama administration 17 years later. Another stride was made in June of 2003 when the Supreme Court decriminalized same-sex sexual relations, a law that is still active in other countries worldwide. A win for the transgender community came in 2016 when the Pentagon lifted the ban on transgender people serving in the military. With each right gained, there is still the looming risk of it being repealed or struck down by new administrations. But we are still fighting for queer rights, and we continue to fight to maintain the LGBT rights that we do have. Yet we must celebrate the victories that have been won, victories such as same-sex marriage equality. Former President Barack Obama designated the Stonewall Inn, Christopher Park, and Christopher Street as a national monument for their incredible significance in lighting the flame of the queer rights movement. In his speech on the Supreme Court marriage equality ruling, former President Obama proudly stated, "Our nation was founded on a bedrock principle that we are all created equal. The project of each generation is to bridge the meaning of those founding words with the realities of changing times, a never-ending quest to ensure those words ring true for every single American. Progress on this journey often comes in small increments, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, compelled by the persistent effort of dedicated citizens. And then sometimes there are days like this, when that slow, steady effort is rewarded with justice that arrives like a thunderbolt. With the efforts of thousands of people on June 26, 2015, same-sex unions were legalized, and those paths would not have been open if not for Stonewall. The rioters of the Stonewall riots bravely demanded their liberty and justice, both inalienable rights under that founding principle that we are all created equal. Without the brave men, women, and every person in between who valiantly fought for those rights at Stonewall in 1969, we would not be on the righteous path to equality that we are traveling today. Thank you, Stonewall, for breaking down the barriers and letting the rainbow light shine through for all to see."